You're tuned into the Spot-Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot-Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. In today's episode, the Spurs' training camp roster seems set, with the team bringing back veteran Bismack Biyombo. Also, upcoming questions for training camp and the preseason. Welcome back to another episode of the Spot-Up Pod. It's been about 2 weeks since I last recorded an episode. We are still in the NBA offseason, so there hasn't been too much going on with the San Antonio Spurs, but it's going to quickly get going here with training camp starting next week. So let's first begin by revisiting the news from this past 2 weeks. So let's first begin by our first topic, which is the latest roster moves by the Spurs in these last 2 weeks and the return of Bismack Biyombo to the team. So since the last episode, the Spurs have signed 2 players and then waived them for the Austin Spurs roster. Those 2 players were forward Osayi Osifo, who played with Austin last season and was also on the Spurs' Summer League team, and also guard Isaiah Miller, who was also on the Spurs' Austin Spurs' team in the G League last season. So basically, the Spurs signed and waived these players, and this is pretty normal right now in the offseason for most NBA teams if they plan on having some players on their G League team this upcoming season. So what happens is the players will sign an Exhibit 10 contract with the NBA team, so with the Spurs, San Antonio, then they'll get waived about a day or two later. And what that does is that as long as those 2 players sign with Austin and they play on the Austin Spurs roster for 60 consecutive days, they're going to get a bonus of $85,300 just by being on San Antonio's roster, getting waived, and then signing with Austin and staying on Austin for at least 60 days, according to Bobby Marks, who has that information. So right now, you're going to see this happening with a bunch of NBA teams. 2 players to watch that used to be on the Spurs team are Charles Bassey, who signed a training camp contract with the Atlanta Hawks, and also David Duke Jr., who's also on a training camp contract with the Phoenix Suns. So after waiving Miller, the Spurs did have 1 open roster spot. So with that roster spot, they brought back 6'8" veteran center Bismack Biyombo. So if we recall back to last season, Biyombo joined the team after the news came out that Victor Wembanyama would be out for the rest of the season with that blood clot issue. And so the Spurs signed Biyombo to finish out the season. He plays in 28 games with San Antonio last season from about February to April. He averaged 5.1 points, 5.6 rebounds, 1.1 assists, 1 turnover, and 0.8 blocks at 18.8 minutes per game. As for his projected role this season, though, with Wemby back, with the addition of Luke Cornett and the addition of Kelly Olynyk, he's likely going to mainly be a center out there for depth in terms of being behind those 3 players in the rotation, and mainly only getting into games in the event that, one of the bigs gets injured, if one of the bigs gets in foul trouble, or if maybe it's a game where it's in blowout range, either the Spurs are winning or losing, and maybe just Coach Mitch Johnson puts out some players for the final 5 minutes of that game. And if Biyombo's on the active roster that night, then expect to see him out there. So again, he won't have the same role as he had last season, where he was the starting center once Wemby got injured, but he's there more so as just another big to have out there for some more depth there at the center spot. What was interesting is the type of contract that Biyombo got. So the Spurs signed him to what's called an Exhibit 9 training camp contract. And what this does is it's a veteran minimum contract, but it protects the player in the event that he gets injured during training camp and he's waived by the team. So if Biyombo were to get injured and the Spurs waived him, he would get $15,000 guaranteed. Again, that information comes from Bobby Marks. What's different, though, about Biyombo's signing as a training camp player is that the Spurs actually put out a press release for him when he re-signed. The Spurs, put out a social media post. They also issued a press release to the media, and so they don't typically do this for players on training camp contracts. That's just not something that they do, and so that's what makes it more likely that Biyombo ends up staying on the team past training camp in the preseason and ends up making the final roster. However, I also do think that because he's on a training camp contract, this does open a slight window for one of those other training camp invites like Micah Potter, Adam Flagler, or Stanley Amude to possibly get that final standard roster spot in the event one of those players really stands out in training camp in the preseason, and the Spurs, have to weigh that decision of do they waive Biyombo and bring in one of these players on a standard contract, or just waive those 3 players. So again, it was just a little interesting that they signed him to an Exhibit 9 contract, not just a flat out either partially guaranteed contract or a guaranteed contract. But again, they also acknowledge that he's on the team by issuing that press release compared to what they usually don't do for players on training camp contracts. So with Biyombo back on the team, the Spurs do currently have a full training camp roster of 21 players. So their roster breaks down like this: 13 players on guaranteed contracts, 1 player on a partially guaranteed contract in Lindy Waters III. they have 3 players on two-way contracts, and now they have 4 players on training camp contracts. So the Spurs can have 21 players from now until the training camp and then the preseason. But then the day before opening night of the regular season for NBA teams, which is October 20th, the Spurs do need to reduce their roster to 18 players, and that means having 15 players on standard contracts and then 3 players on two-way contracts. So again, right now that looks like that final spot is Biyombo's, but again, if one of those training camp players has a breakout training camp in preseason, then possibly there's the doors open to possibly give one of those players that final standard roster spot. All right, so for our next topic, I just kind of want to go through some questions I have, for the upcoming training camp and the preseason. Again, not really looking toward the regular season just yet, just focusing on these next few weeks of early October when the Spurs start training camp here, and just looking at some roles on the team and some players on the team and some questions I have. And again, we don't have the answers because the players haven't participated yet in training camp or the preseason, but these are just my guiding questions going into these next few weeks of training camp and preseason. So my first question is, what happens with the backup point guard position? So obviously we know, as I addressed last episode, that Dylan Harper is likely to miss all of training camp and the preseason due to his thumb injury, but he should be back for the regular season. So my first question is, in training camp and preseason, do the Spurs have De'Aaron Fox and Stephon Castle, start together in the backcourt, but then one of those players kind of takes over the backup point guard minutes, stagger the minutes between the two players? That's my first question. Again, that's a lot to put on those players at such an early point in the season. I mean, in the preseason. So again, I don't think they go that route, at least in the preseason or training camp. Maybe they do that in the regular season if Harper's not back yet. Or does a veteran point guard like Jordan McLaughlin run those backup point guard minutes right now until Harper gets back? I think that's a very likely scenario. Or this also opens up a door for a young player who just got on the roster like David Jones-Garcia, who's on a two-way contract, to possibly be given a chance to run the backup point in training camp and preseason and see how he progresses with that role. And maybe if he does pretty well, maybe he can beat out McLaughlin for that spot and then hold that spot down until Dylan Harper gets 100% healthy and is ready to go in the regular season. So again, that's one of my first questions is regarding the rotation in these first few weeks of training camp and preseason is, who runs that backup point guard role? My next question is, who gets the backup wing minutes? So there is a potential spot open, or at least some players can battle for in the backup wing spot. So let me just kind of talk about the rotation, how I kind of see it going into training camp. So obviously, I think the starting lineup is going to be De'Aaron Fox, Stephon Castle, Devin Vassell, Harrison Barnes, and Victor Wembanyama. And then off the bench, I think players who are guaranteed minutes off the bench in some sort of role are Keldon Johnson, Jeremy Sohan, Luke Cornett, and then also Kelly Olynyk in some form, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later. I think he's going to get to play in multiple games, be in the rotation, maybe not a consistent role, but he'll be, in there depending on different lineup matchups. So along with whoever's going to run the backup point guard, I think that does leave an opening wing spot or guard spot next to Keldon Johnson off the bench. So who's going to be that other player next to Keldon Johnson? As I've talked about here on the Spot Up Pod and as I've written about over on the spotupshot.com, I do think that this is Julian Champagnie's role to lose because, as I noted before, Julian's been on the team for a number of years with the Spurs. Now he knows the system, has played under Coach Mitch Johnson, has, been a starter with the Spurs, been come off the bench as well. And, brings that outside shooting, also, pretty good defensive skills as well. So I do think that right now, on paper, I would say this is Julian Champagnie's spot to lose that backup wing spot. But I think that leaves the door open for two players to try to get those minutes, and that is in training camp and preseason. And those two players are Lindy Waters III, who was signed, again, to a partially guaranteed contract, or rookie Carter Bryant, who we saw some of his stellar defensive play in Summer League, but obviously, his offense may not quite be there just yet, entering his first NBA season. So I do think that in training camp and preseason, that's one of the battles to watch is can either Lindy Waters III or Carter Bryant beat out Julian Champagnie for those backup wing minutes going into opening night of the regular season for those, for those first few games of the regular season. So again, that's another kind of training camp battle I'm kind of watching here going into training camp. My next question is, where exactly does Kelly Olynyk play? Like I said, I think he's going to play quite a bit during the regular season. I just don't know if it's more so on maybe not a night-to-night basis. It's more so just matchup dependent on who the Spurs are playing that night. So if we just kind of look at, first of all, some of the bigs that are on the Spurs already, of course, I think that he could play well next to Wemby, being able to provide, passing and spacing alongside Victor, who can play inside or outside. Then, of course, I think he could play well as well against alongside Luke Cornett. Cornett's more so a big who likes to set picks, kind of help on the offensive glass, help out. Operate near the dunker spot. Whereas, so then Olynyk fits with him because offensively, at least he would be able to kind of space out and leave Cornett some room to operate inside while he's spacing out from the outside. So when I look at the Spurs' first 2 games of the regular season, I just look at the bigs that they're likely to face in these first 2 games whenever the season starts in October. So on opening night, they are going to face the Dallas Mavericks, who feature a front court with Anthony Davis, Daniel Gafford, Derek Lively II, Cooper Flagg, and PJ Washington. So again, five bigs who kind of play that power forward center role there in Dallas. And so the Spurs are combating that lineup with Victor Wembanyama, Harrison Barnes, Luke Cornett, and Jeremy Sohan. So I think that's 4 players in the front court. So I think against a team like Dallas, who has bigs who want to kind of drop and play, really protect the paint, like Anthony Davis, Daniel Gafford, and Lively, I think that's a situation against Dallas where Kelly Olynyk, yes, he does get a lot of minutes where he's able to play alongside Wemby or alongside Cornett to be able to pull some of those bigs away from the paint with his outside shooting ability and passing ability. So again, against a team like Dallas, I could see Olynyk playing a good number of minutes. Then we look at their second game, the Spurs in October. They're going to play the New Orleans Pelicans. So the Pelicans have Yves Missy as their center. They have Zion Williamson, of course, as their power forward. They added Kevon Looney from the Golden State Warriors in the offseason, who's likely to be their backup center. And then Derek Queen, the player they drafted, can play center or power forward, but he's right now he's on the injured list, so I don't know if he'll be clear by the second game of the season. But they also have a stretch big in Carlo Matkovic right now, the Pelicans. So because the Pelicans have more so I would say like traditional bigs there, like Yves Missy and Kevon Looney, only 2 of them. I do think that against a team like New Orleans, maybe Olynyk doesn't play as much that night against the Pelicans. So that's what I mean about, I think his minutes are going to be more matchup dependent. It just really matters about who the opposing team has in the front court, whether or not Olynyk's going to get a lot of minutes that night. That's my question about Kelly Olynyk in terms of his role. My final question I have is, will one of the training camp invites really stand out to warrant a standard roster spot? So, as I mentioned earlier, the 3 players battling for spots are Micah Potter, Adam Flagler, and Stanley Amude. Micah Potter's more so like, stretch kind of forward, kind of plays a little bit of 4 and 5. Adam Flagler is more so an outside shooting point guard. And then you have Stanley Amude, who stretches the floor from outside as a wing. Also, had some decent opportunities on defense as well. So again, I just wonder if can any of these players shine in preseason and training camp to maybe make the Spurs think about, should they have to waive Bismack Biyombo to give one of those players a spot? I would say that if there's a player who I think has a chance to maybe really show something in training camp and preseason, I think that's a player like Micah Potter who can be more so like that Sandro Mamukelashvili role where he comes in as a reserve, can really step out and hit the 3, brings a lot of energy, kind of a versatile player as well on offense and defense. So again, I think that Potter's the most interesting player to kind of watch amongst these 3 training camp invites along with Biyombo. So again, I think that one of those 3 players would have to really stand out in these next 3 weeks of preseason in the training camp to have the Spurs have to make that decision of whether or not they want to waive Biyombo to open up a spot for a player like Micah Potter. So again, I think that's my final question. Those are like the main 4 questions I guess I have going into training camp in the preseason. And as we know, in preseason, a lot of times the players, normal rotation players will be held out of some games just because the team doesn't want to risk any kind of injury, or if they do play the whole rotation, they'll just play for like a quarter or 2. They won't play the entire 4 quarters. So again, those were just some of my guiding questions going into training camp and the preseason. Let's keep going. All right, finally, let's close out this episode with some news and notes regarding the Spurs for some past events and also some upcoming events regarding their calendar. So going back to Wednesday, September 10th, the Spurs did a great thing for the community of the Hill Country that was impacted by those floods in July. Back on Wednesday, September 10th, they visited the Hill Country. They held an open practice and they to show their support for the community impacted by the July floods. If you visit their social media page on X, the Spurs' social media page, they have a lot of clips of like Wemby out there and a bunch of players out there, and then the coaching staff and the players talking to the community out there. So again, that's over on their social media feed if you'd like to see that. And then on Sunday, September 14th, it was Victor Wembanyama's idea to add this new supporter section at home games for the Spurs. And so a bunch of fans came out on Sunday, September 14th. Wemby was in attendance and he was the judge, and he got to see their kind of I guess like celebrations or what they like to do to try to earn a spot there. And so there are 5 spots being offered right now for the 5 craziest fans, and Wemby's gonna the Spurs and Wemby will select those fans, and then Victor's actually going to cover the expenses for those fans. So again, that was held on Sunday, September 14th. Now, some important upcoming dates coming up here in both September and October. So obviously next Monday, Monday is the official start of training camp, which they'll begin with just a media day. So September 29th will be the Spurs' media day. Typically, you'll hear the head coach talk. So Mitch Johnson will speak first, and then you'll hear a bunch of not every single player, but most of the players on the team. Then on Tuesday, September 30th, it is the first day of training camp and practice for the Spurs. So then now the Spurs start to actually get in there, learn the new philosophies and coaching strategies from Mitch Johnson and his coaching staff. And then, of course, all the players that are healthy will be there to participate in those practices. Then there's going to be basically 6 days of training camp before the Spurs' first preseason comes up on Monday, October 6th versus the Guangzhou Long Lions. And that game will take place in San Antonio. So again, 6 days of practice before the first game begins on October 6th, which is a preseason game. And then an important date to watch in October, as I talked about last week's episode, is October 20th when Jeremy Sohan and the Spurs, that is the deadline for them to, if they have interest, they would have to reach an agreement on a rookie contract extension by that deadline of October 20th. Finally, don't forget to visit the spotupshot.com. I wrote a piece, basically like a mailbag type of piece over on the spotupshot.com. It's called the Inbox Part 1, where some fans sent in some questions and I answered them there in that mailbag. And so some of the questions I looked at were, the projected starting lineup, what I'm most looking forward to this upcoming season for the Spurs in terms of wins and the rotation spots to watch. And then lastly, I was also asked a question of whether or not I thought Jeremy Sohan would play more minutes than Harrison Barnes in this forthcoming season. So, basically, it's here. So this is the final week that the Spurs are off, and then it's going to start here. Media day next Monday, the 29th, and then training camp starts, and then preseason, and boom, the regular season's here. And then here we go, 82 games, and then possibly the playoffs for the Spurs. So my next episode, I will say, will likely come out after media day and after a few training camp practices. So before the preseason game on October 6th, but so somewhere in that window, I'll have a new episode. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Spot Up Pod. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Spot Up Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spot Up Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening and have a great day.